Welcome to Season 3 of Voices of Australia, where we embark on a journey through the heart of social cohesion. In this thought-provoking podcast series, we delve into the diverse tapestry of Australian society, weaving together the stories, experiences and perspectives that contribute to our nation's unity. From conversations with community leaders and experts in their fields, to personal narratives of everyday Australians, Voices of Australia Series 3 explores the challenges and triumphs of fostering social cohesion in a dynamic and ever-evolving society. Whether you're a seasoned advocate for social harmony or just beginning to explore the nuances of Australian identity, this podcast invites you to listen, learn and engage in the vital dialogue surrounding social cohesion. Grace is an award-winning social entrepreneur, a human rights lawyer and founder of Citizen Tasmania. She is internationally recognised for her advocacy work as a 2022 Echoing Green Global Fellow and a 2023 United Nations Human Rights Fellow. A global leader in social innovation, Grace is a founding member of the African Descendant Social Entrepreneurs Network and the Asia Pacific Network for People of African Descent. A filmmaker and creative cultural practitioner, Grace works with the Australian Film, Television and Radio School to create innovative programs that build the capacity of young Tasmanians to share their stories. Hello, Grace. How are you?
I'm well, thank you, Anthea. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. It's really delightful to have you with us and all the way from Tasmania. So we're thrilled that you've been able to join this podcast. I wondered if we might just start by you telling us a little bit about what Citizen Tasmania actually is.
So Citizen Tasmania is a very, very small non-for-profit designed to support people of migrant, refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds to resettle in Tasmania. And resettlement means something very different for a lot of people. For a lot of migrants and people from refugee backgrounds, it might mean connecting with a lost dream that they had before they started their journey of resettlement. So the role of Citizen Tasmania is to work alongside people of migrant, refugee and asylum-seeking backgrounds to reach their potential in Tasmania. I founded it from a perspective of looking at how in many cases when people resettle in Australia, there's this desire and need to really feel a sense of belonging and connection, but that desire is often thwarted by systemic racism. So the idea of Citizen is about what does it mean to belong without those racial categories or I guess limiting factors that make people feel like they're not a part of Australia. So in doing this work, we look specifically about how we can empower people from migrant refugee backgrounds to gain social capital, to be able to express themselves in their new home and feel like a part of culture. So that means addressing what are the gaps in resettlement that make it so challenging in an abundant country like Australia for everyone to thrive and to feel like a part of our culture. So for me, it's looking at how racial justice is a fundamental part of human rights and an expression of human rights, and creating a space where we can have positive resources for identity, belonging and well-being in migrant, refugee and asylum-seeking communities in Australia.
Great. Thanks, Grace. That helps to give some context. Can you perhaps tell us some of the actual types of programs or initiatives that Citizen Tasmania does?
A big part of what we do is literacy. We're finding that in our communities, when I don't know if everyone's aware, but Tasmania has a functional illiteracy rate of about 48%. So we have massive challenges with literacy in Tasmania. And for a lot of families that resettle here, having culturally appropriate education is incredibly difficult. So people often end up stuck not having access to the English language support to be able to get employment. So we hear stories of people who have been in TAFE for 10, 15 years, who are still attempting to learn the language skills so that they can seek employment, so that they can have more agency and choices in their lives, but they're stuck in this educational gap. So a lot of our work is supporting literacy efforts in those communities. It also is enabling employment options and working with local councils and other government agencies to design policies that specifically target that gap. So a big part of what we've been doing at the moment is supporting people bilingually with digital literacy skills, knowing that women from migrant and refugee backgrounds really, really struggle to get online, noticing that the changes in artificial intelligence and in all of these new technologies, they're not the benefits of that, and also the risks of that are getting fed into communities where people don't feel as trusting of government institutions. So helping people get online, bridging some of the those inequality gaps. So a lot of families that we work with often have one device. They're really struggling to understand what it is to be on the internet. And so our work is supporting those communities to either be safe online or to get the skills that they need to effectively navigate the online space as everything is becoming online.
Now, there is some differences in the Tasmanian education system compared to other states around Australia. Does that interfere with the ability of new arrivals to actually achieve their aspirations?
It really does. Like in the news recently, the grade 12 attainment level, like grade year 11 and 12 attainment level in Tasmania is really low. I think that for a lot of families who are coming into Tasmania, there's an expectation that education will just be like world class, but we're in a real challenge here because the way that we teach literacy in Tasmania is not structured. We don't have we're moving towards a structured literacy program, but a lot of families who struggle with English end up in a system where they're not able to be taught English. The children aren't be able to taught English in a structured literacy way. I'm finding that so for families who access the TAFE system, there's this huge intergenerational gap where sometimes their children might be able to read, or they might be able to, they might have just the amount of literacy to get through, but they're not able to support their child on that journey. So there isn't targeted support for how do you support the educational aspect of resettlement, because for us, it's like that's such a critical factor, supporting that intergenerational bond between parent and child, learning how to have access to structured literacy. There's been a lot of work to change that policy, but again, because of the barriers that stop people from migrant refugee background to access that, the filter on of that policy is less and less. So we see that oftentimes when policy changes come, people of migrant refugee asylum seeking backgrounds get left behind because they're the last ones that experience the implementation of structured literacy. And that's really, really challenging for people who are desperately wanting to be educated and wanting their families to be educated, but just can't access it within the state of Tasmania.
But I'm imagining that the difficulty in being able to attain a year 12 certificate then makes it changes one's ability to actually reach the aspirations that you might have or that your family might have for you. So I imagine that managing those expectations or assisting in how young people might actually be able to go and achieve year 12 and then go on to university is a difficult process. How do you go about managing those expectations?
It's really interesting because the families that we work with have great expectations for their children, and they can't. And it's so sad, like having to express the limitations of what is available and possible, particularly when I think for a lot of parents, they see themselves as lacking in being able to provide the support to their children to make these big leaps that they weren't able to make. And for us, we say to them that it's not just about you, it's a system. It's a whole entire system that isn't equipped with the cultural skills to resettle and really understand what you need to thrive in this context.
It is so difficult, isn't it, when when half the reason that they've come is because they want their children to get the best education that they possibly can, and yet that just seems that much further away for them once they get here. So I can completely understand that. It's interesting because you travel a great deal and have responsibilities that are global. I'm interested in your views about how you position Tasmania and Tasmania's options, or for that matter, Australians, in relation to the global experiences that you've seen.
Oh, that's a really good question. I find it very challenging working within Tasmania because when I go and express to people at the United Nations and, with my colleagues at Echo and Green and other fellows, when I tell them that our functional literacy rate is at this percentage, and when I tell them that, people really do struggle to find their way, it's almost a shock to them because Australia is not perceived as a country with challenges. I work in social innovation, I work in racial equity, and people are honestly shocked when I give them these statistics about what's going on in Tasmania and what we're working on, because they just think, we don't have that perception of Australia. We don't see Australia as a country with problems. And on the surface, we've got a really high standard of living here, and we've got lots of great social supports. So I notice that when I talk about educational attainment and connecting support, and even the fact that, in Tasmania, we have the lowest rates of digital inclusion in Australia. Like, we don't have a lot of people who are able to be online, let alone people from migrant refugee backgrounds. It's always a shock to people, the work that we do and the need for it. So in comparison, I think sometimes I wonder if it would be easier working on literacy and digital education in actual Africa than it would be in Tasmania, because in trying to work internationally, you're breaking the perception that Australia is all right and we don't have to work on these problems and people aren't really meeting their aspirations or their children's aspirations. So I find that in certain contexts, it's a lot easier to talk about human rights issues and educational contexts within different countries. But when it comes to Australia, when I want to talk about the issue, they're like, no, you're fine. You don't need any support and help. You don't need any social innovation here. And I think, we actually do, because we're still dealing with complex problems that impact people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested then in your view about how would you define or describe social cohesion? What does that mean to you?
That's a fantastic question. I think social cohesion comes back to this thriving concept for me. At the center of it, it's educational attainment. So for educational attainment, empowerment, and social connection, I think social capital is often missed off the radar when it comes to measuring the impact of resettlement. But in a small place like Tasmania, social capital is what enables you access to employment. It's what enables you access to opportunities. And so when we talk about social cohesion, I find that what is missing from the narrative when it comes to people of migrant refugee background is, how do we support them to have social capital to meet their own needs, to thrive within their new homes, and to have access to the support. For me, it starts with education, and that's cross-cultural education. That's, I think, people being aware that anyone who's coming to this context of Australia is coming with a very different and rich cultural background that needs to be valued and can support the thriving of Australia collectively. And it's also the empowerment and agency to be able to, for an individual to be able to navigate a new culture, knowing that their skills are valued, knowing that they have the social capital to be able to to be able to meet their aspirations. Thriving is such a central part of a refugee journey, a migration journey, and being able to have social cohesion is to be able to support the thriving of everyone in an Australian context.
It's such an interesting topic, social cohesion, and So a lot of people, I think, may not be, they're very aware of Melbourne and Sydney being places where new arrivals come first, or certainly that they've got a lot of cultural diversity in those locations. I think people aren't necessarily aware of the degree of cultural diversity that sits within Tasmania. And you've got some very large diaspora populations there. Are you finding that that there is a sense of welcome, that there is an ability to build that cohesion within Tasmania?
It's really tricky because Tasmania's population is very small, and yes, we do have a diaspora, but one of our challenges is that we struggle to retain people of migrant refugee backgrounds. They come into and this is the difficulty with the work that we do. They come to the island, and because there is, I would like to say, a lack of inbuilt cultural infrastructure, because there is a heavy reliance on service providers whose role really is to connect people to service, not to build the cultural infrastructure for people to have the agency and empowerment and the social capital to stay and have employment. It means that there's a arrival and then there's a mass exodus. So the ability to actually build a cultural social infrastructure is really challenging in Tasmania, and it's challenging for a complex reason. And a big part of why we do the work that we do is to enable a grassroots positive resource for identity, belonging and well-being led by people from that background, so that there isn't this deficit model of people come, they need help, and that's all they are, and they're not able to contribute and fill a part. Because when that model, which is the dominant paradigm in Tasmania, it's like, okay, when you see somebody from that background, they obviously want a service, not, okay, they might want to be an agent of change, and so that makes it difficult for people to have that identity of citizenship, of belonging, even if they do have it. And so we deal with people who come and they're like, actually, this is not for me. I want the Melbourne-Sydney experience, because in that Melbourne-Sydney experience, I can better reflect who I am. I have the social capital. And most importantly, I have the social connections to thrive. And so for us, from a Tasmanian context, we have this interest in wanting to grow our population, because we have a small and an aging population that needs to be revitalized by people of migrant refugee backgrounds, but we struggle to retain them. And that's a real challenge for us as a state.
Yeah, I had heard that there was a lack of places for people to practice their faith. That was one of the reasons why they were moving to other locations as well, quite apart from all the other opportunities that might exist in other places. But Tasmania does attract quite a number of international students too, doesn't it? So do you have a sense of why international students come to Tasmania? And when they're there, what is it that they're finding that they really like about Tasmania, particularly in that sort of more global context?
Tasmania, we have the cleanest air in the world. It's just, we have the most beautiful place to study. And, if you've grown up in a city and you move to a place like Tasmania, if you live in Hobart, where one of the main university campuses is, it's just Kunani, it's Mount Wellington. It's the most beautiful place in the world. And that is it's a very attractive place to study if you're looking for a different experience where you have access to nature. And I also think that for studying things like the sciences, we're really excellent in maritime studies. So we have a lot of opportunities in that space. And I think that in terms of being able to really build social connections, the scale of our town, I'm calling it a town because it's so small, allows more social connection within groups. So sometimes, we struggle because we're small, but also because we're small, we have the opportunity to build closer relationships. So that's also, I think, maybe an asset for why some international students would want to come and study here.
I'm sure, absolutely. The organisation you founded, Citizen Tasmania, I'm intrigued about the term citizen and why that's so powerful, because we do know that individuals who take out citizenship certainly do have a very clear sense of belonging to this country or to the area in which they're living. Why do you think that sense of why? Well, one, why did you name it Citizen Tasmania? What's the power in that word? And then, what do you think we can do about encouraging more people to think of becoming formal citizens rather than sort of practicing informal citizenship?
That's a really great question, and it was really interesting. I wanted to name it Citizen to push back at this idea that if you're from a migrant, refugee, asylum-seeking background, you're always in a migrant. You're always going to be a refugee, because
perpetual foreigner.
A perpetual foreigner in a country where you actually belong. And so I have this conversation a lot with young people from migrant, refugee, asylum-seeking background, where it's almost like that title becomes a narrative that then defines how you engage with Australia for the rest of your life. And I'm like, no, as soon as you're here, if you've experienced any form of statelessness and you call Australia home, you are a citizen, and you should not, you come from an interesting background, but you should be able to identify strongly with your home now because you vote here. And this is your space. You have duties and obligation as a citizen as well, and you should be seen as that. And so a lot of the spaces that are around Tasmania like perpetually are around, okay, we do migrant, we support migrants. And it's like, there's nothing wrong with having a migrant identity, but I noticed that there wasn't an extra layer of this concept of, okay, when do I stop? Like when does the migration journey stop? And this is, I think, a matter of social cohesion. Is if the migration journey has stopped, then what's the alternative? Like what are we calling people of migrant refugee backgrounds? Are we calling them Australian citizens who need support around their educational attainment? What is it that we need to do to help people feel like their identity is rooted within the country that they now call home? And so calling it Citizen was my way of saying that, we all have access to universal human rights. If we live in Australia, we should feel like we belong and we are citizens. And it's a little bit like tricky because we sometimes, people are sometimes a little bit confused about that, but it's coming from that ethos that your background shouldn't define how you place yourself in Australia, especially when you do have your citizenship papers and you are asked to vote and you are asked to be a part of our community.
It's nice to know that the vast majority of Australians do believe that people can come from anywhere and would be just as good an Australian citizen as somebody who was born here. So that's a very reassuring statistic, I think. I had the chance to travel and stay in Canada this earlier last year, and one of the things I asked over there was for people to define integration. When do you know whether you're integrated or not? What does that actually look like? Because we talk a lot about integration. I wondered if you had a view about how should we think about integration, and how should we think about sort of that personal experience of integration, because it is a very individual thing that when you feel integrated and when you don't. For you or for others, the people that you work with, what do you think integration actually looks like?
That's such a big question because, again, as you highlighted, it is individual as well. I really like the Canadian model of citizenship because I've had some experiences in Canada as well, particularly with the Canadian Institute of Citizenship, and the way they perceive that is is integration isn't about losing your cultural identity. It isn't about becoming something that you're not. It's about being able to take everything that you have and feel like you can make a contribution. We work around an ethic of thriving model with Citizen in the work that we do, which is that to move from like integration for me, and I don't know if this is a little bit simplistic, is moving from surviving to thriving. So anytime you resettle in a new place, there's always a cultural shock. There's always the feeling of disassociation and having to rebuild your identity in a new community. For me, what can be classified as being integrated is having the ability to thrive within your new context, having the social capital, having the ability to have choice and agency, to understand your context and to reach your aspirations. So that's a full expression of your human rights. So I would say that thriving, like integration, is a journey. It's an ongoing relational thing. There isn't a point where it's like, oh, it's perfect. It's people are always going to wrap themselves around in and out of both cultures. And I think if we can see it as thriving or social cohesion, that would be an ideal way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as we mentioned earlier, you do travel quite a lot, and you've sort of briefly mentioned how people view Australia, or some aspects of Australia. When you think about an Australian identity, or when people ask you about being Australian, what comes to mind? How do you define an Australian identity, do you think?
That's really hard because, as you know, Australia is like a 51.1% migrant country. So it's like it's coming from a diaspora, coming from an African diaspora, and it's also coming from Australia, like and growing up in a place like Tasmania and having the accent that I do, which can be very confusing for a lot of people, especially Americans who just don't understand why we speak like this or how we manage to speak like this. I think Australian identity is layered when you are this thing called a third culture kid, or you're in the in-between of having resettled and, you know, knowing your traditional culture and roots, but also living in a different culture from that and integrating that. So the way I express it is that I perceive Australian values to be one of to be of equality, really, of being able to, I guess, express yourself within multiple contexts. And it's so hard to describe my Australian identity because I'm still wrapping my head around it and I'm still navigating it in weird spaces. Like I can say, though, that in engaging with the UN and in doing lots of things on a global policy level, I can say that where my Australian identity comes out the most is in my willingness to listen and collaborate. I'm noticing that it's a very Australian thing to be within a room of Americans or maybe other people who have a lot of things to say, and just like sitting there and taking it all in and being able to prioritize the more social aspects and openness and a down-to-earthness. I don't know how to describe it. It's just being grounded and noticing the value of the human connection rather than the goal. And I can't really say that that's an Australian thing or not, but I do feel like growing up basically in a kind of country town, we have a more down-to-earth, accessible, open spirit that is different. So I always get accused of being extremely friendly and open. And I think that's because I grew up in Tasmania, where the norm is being extremely friendly and open and accessible.
I think you're right, though. I think there is a real Australianness about that. We certainly have heard that from others that have been either, you know, on a group of people that have gone to the UN or a group of people that have gone to a conference in America. And there is quite a different style from the people that they come across when they're in those particular places. Do you have you heard from others in America or in the United Nations or wherever about how they view Australia? I mean, you mentioned before that they think we're a wealthy country and that everything's fine. Are there other aspects of how they talk about the Australian identity?
I feel like in many ways people lack an understanding of Australia. I mean, I always get accused of the fact that the Tasmanian devil is actually a cartoon. And then I have to tell people, well, it's real. And they're always quite shocked because specifically coming from Tasmania, their view, the only cultural encounter that they've had with Australia is a Looney Tunes cartoon about the Tasmanian devil. So people would often talk to me about that, and they're quite shocked that, you know, it is a marsupial, it does exist, and it's going through a lot of stressful things at the moment. We're doing a lot of research to fixing the facial tumor in Tasmania. So I think a lot of people aren't as clearly aware of our identity and are always curious and interested in finding out more about us. We're kind of a mystery country, and we have this allure to us about surfing and beach life. And
so do you think they orient more to the geography and to the animals rather than actually to a population of people?
I think, yeah, they completely are more thinking about it from the perspective of, oh, you're so far away. Definitely not doing a conference there because you're so, it's that I think the geographical isolation means that our cultural contributions and our way of being and our lifestyle isn't well understood. And I also think that as Australians, we're not big noters. We're not the type of people who are going to be market ourselves widely enough. So a lot of people aren't as aware of who we are and what we do. So it's always interesting having conversations in that context.
So being a fellow in Echoing Green, which is based in New York, quite apart from your amazing intellect and awareness, what is it that you think as an Australian you're bringing to that particular organisation and the way that they actually go about solving problems or thinking about problems?
It's a really interesting question because, I mean, Echoing Green Fellows are some of the most thought-leading individuals I've ever come across. I'm always amazed when I'm in the room with Echoing Green Fellows because I'm just wow, what a privilege to be in a community of people that are so on the edge of social innovation, some of the best social impact leaders in the world. I think my presence as Echoing Green, talking about Australian issues, helps people to understand the interconnectedness of some of the problems that we're solving. So I was on a call recently and we were talking about, you know, how do we address systemic cultural racial justice issues? And the networking effect of Echoing Green and the people there is that you sometimes, as a person working on an island that's a little bit isolated from the world, there is this feeling that the challenges that the world are currently facing aren't no one else is going through it. And so my presence in Echoing Green, I feel is this unifying factor for a lot of these global leaders who are trying to address some of the world's biggest problems. And they have my perspective from Tasmania. So it's almost like we're operating like a brains trust for each other. And having an Australian perspective is supporting an ecosystem of change that enables people to see, well, you know, literacy, for example, yes, you're trying to deal with literacy, you know, from an American or sub-Saharan African perspective, but we're also having literacy challenges in Tasmania. We're also having settlement challenges. And so my presence there helps to elevate these global issues and help us come up with solutions collectively on how we address it. So it's the brains trust understanding of Australia that also helps all of us do and continue to do our work in the world.
Grace, I'm constantly coming across individuals who want to do more for their communities, but also want to change things in the world. I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit about your history and how you've come to be doing the work that you're doing.
It's so good to see that there's an appetite for change. And I think that social change work is not easy, but it's people that are on the ground, that are passionate. They're the ones that are really shifting systems. So for me, my experience of getting involved in change work was, again, being resettled in a place like Tasmania and finding that, like, seeing a whole community of people leave because there wasn't enough cultural infrastructure, there wasn't enough agency, there wasn't enough social capital, and watching a cycle repeat itself over and over and over again. I specifically studied law. I went to law school, and I noticed that even in my attempt of potentially using the law as a social justice tool, I could see the massive gaps in how do you actually support people to even understand law? How do you support people to become active citizens? That's such a challenge. So for me, my journey of social change began from lived experience, but also from understanding that having the ability to communicate, for example, having the ability to read and write is so powerful that if other people don't have access to literacy, don't have access to the ability to also access that education, they wouldn't be able to come to the conclusions about the world that I have come to, which is to create change. So my journey really started in understanding how even when we have the most excellent legal systems in the world, people still get left behind because they can't access them.
So Grace, when did you come to Tasmania?
In 2005.
So how old were you then?
8.
So you went through your education in Tasmania and then went on to university. So what were the experiences that you were having that were helping you to better understand how society worked? Because for a lot of young people, it's very difficult when you're grappling with moving to somewhere new to actually lift yourself out and look more broadly. Was that to do with the way your family also viewed the experience and why you'd come there? Or was it to do with simply it's just an innate part of you?
I think it's a combination of both. It was an innate part of me, but I also think that growing up in West Africa, we had this strong value that education is the key. That education is the key to break through from inequality. And it was so important that everyone could read and write. And so when I came to Australia, I already had that as an embedded value. So I was already, and I think that's what made my resettlement experiences a lot different, because I already had the tools to engage within a new cultural context, because I could read about it, I could learn about it, I could ask questions about it. And I think that's what made the big difference. Having already been like literate, I was able to build on that skill. And so resettlement and seeing what the problem wasn't as difficult for me as it would have been for most people. And that's why I'm such a passionate advocate for education being the beginning of resettlement, because it really does ease your understanding of what's going on around you. So I think it's first being able to notice and compare and have that reflective practice. I think it's really hard to create change when you don't have the language and the communication and literacy tools to reflect on your experiences and why they could be different. And just, I think, being supported to have the confidence to ask questions and say things like, well, what is this thing with citizenship? What is this thing with belonging? And how can we make it accessible for others? And I feel like, when I was in law school, I won a Sandy Duncanson social justice bursary. And so I was able to tell stories from people who weren't as literate about human rights. And I was able to then communicate those conversations out. And it's through that ongoing relationship with community, listening and understanding, that has made me so passionate about what can be done to support people's educational attainment so they're in a position where I was, to look at the world around them and make the choices that they needed to make to thrive or do the work that they felt passionate about.
Yeah. So just a final question, Grace, because it's been a fascinating conversation. What advice would you give to young people that actually would like to do the sorts of things that you're doing, as in change things in the local area and then go on and perhaps change the world?
Well, I would say the best way to change the world is to be really grounded and connected within your community. Reflect on your values, reflect on what you feel like is missing, and have conversations with people. Change work is relational. I would not be able to do the work that I do if it wasn't for a community of people and amazing supporters who continually invest in this work. So I think the power of building relationships and investing in your why, like understanding why you're doing this, and also understanding that the process is just as important as the outcome, that the journey of getting to the change and being and creating the world that you have is about you as well. So not necessarily being focused on the goal, because as hard as I could try to address literacy challenges in Tasmania, I may not be able to, but that doesn't defeat the fact that it's not important and the work that I'm doing isn't important. So I think for a lot of young people, because we're used to things happening really quickly, there's this feeling that just because it hasn't changed, it's not worth doing. But I think getting involved in the process of change in a community of people and being consistent with that is a way to start thinking about global impact.
Oh, thank you very much, Grace. I think your confidence and your resilience and encouragement is going to inspire quite a lot of young people or even older people to try to actually maximise every opportunity that they have. So thank you very much, Grace. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for listening to our Voices of Australia podcast. For more episodes like this one, you can visit the Scanlon Institute website at scanloninstitute, or one word, .org.au.